Hello everyone. Today I will continue sharing with you the love story of Sam and police officer Lee. Wishing you an enjoyable time watching this video. The morning began slowly, gentle like a long breath from the countryside after a deep night. Young sunlight slipped through the vine trellises in front of the yard, falling in thin streaks across the small garden behind the house. Night dew still clung to the vegetable leaves, shimmering as the breeze lightly stirred them, like fragile crystal shards about to dissolve. Lytudiep crouched low among the rows of plants. An old bamboo basket rested beside her, each handful of greens carefully picked and neatly placed, as if every leaf carried its own value and deserved to be treated with care. The soil was still damp, the scent of fresh earth mingling with wild grass in the air. So familiar it softened the heart.
Same's breathing gradually slowed.
The repeated motions, bending down, standing up, gathering vegetables, brushing off soil, felt like a ritual that kept her mind from drifting back to heavy memories. Here in this garden, she didn't need to be on guard or brace herself. She only needed to work and to exist. From the corner of the yard, a flock of chickens suddenly burst out, wings flapping noisily, breaking the quiet moment. Sam let out a soft laugh, small but warm enough to brighten the space. She scattered a handful of grain and watched them peck eagerly, chattering as if there were nothing in the world worth worrying about. Mornings like this repeated day after day, simple, quiet, unremarkable. Yet it was precisely this steadiness that helped Sam rebuild her life from nothing, little by little. Elsewhere, far from that garden, the atmosphere was entirely different. The enclosed office was bathed in cold white light, illuminating stacks of files piled high on the desk. Phones rang incessantly, interrupted by hurried exchanges and meetings that dragged on without end. Police officer Lee barely had a moment to breathe. He rubbed his temples, the fatigue not coming from a single sleepless night, but from too many days spent forcing himself to stay alert. One task followed another, responsibility piled upon responsibility, like a wheel that refused to stop turning. Amid that chaos, an unexpected image surfaced in his mind. Sam, her hands smudged with soil, standing in the wide garden, small in stature yet steady. A smile not bright or showy but quiet and enduring. Just thinking of it lightened his chest slightly. The work didn't lessen, the pressure remained. But he knew that somewhere there existed a place of true calm. And that thought alone was enough for him to straighten his posture, turn to the next file, and continue doing his duty. Near noon, as Sam was still pulling weeds, a harsh sound suddenly tore through the stillness. The screech of brakes rang out right in front of the gate, sharp and urgent, utterly foreign to the familiar sounds of the countryside. Sam startled and looked up. Before she could even stand, a neighbor rushed into the yard, panting, her face pale with alarm. Sam, someone from outside came. They said this land is about to be reclaimed. The words fell like a cold slash. Sam's hand froze. The clump of weeds slipped from her grasp, dirt scattering. Her heart tightened until her breath caught. Reclaimed? She repeated, her voice so small she could barely hear it herself. She stood motionless in the lush green garden, the place where she had poured so much sweat, entrusted so much hope, and pieced her life back together bit by bit. This land was more than just a place to live. It was the only place where she truly felt she belonged. After years of drifting and enduring, the midday wind rustled through the leaves. But inside Sam, a cold emptiness slowly spread. The peace of the morning shattered faster than she had ever imagined. Sam couldn't remember how long she stood frozen in the garden. She only knew that the midday sun still shone, the wind still swept through the vegetable beds, the chickens still bustled about looking for shade. Everything seemed unchanged. Only she was no longer as steady as she had been minutes before. The ground beneath her feet suddenly felt unfamiliar. Not because it had changed, but because the thought of losing everything robbed her of the calm she once had. She bent down to pick up the bamboo basket, her hands trembling so much she had to grip it tightly to keep from dropping it. The neighbor said something more, but Sam didn't hear clearly. The sound seemed to drift away, leaving only one phrase repeating in her mind. Reclaimed. She walked quickly toward the porch, each step heavy as if sinking into mud. Inside the small room, her phone lay still on the table. Sam picked it up, her finger hovering for a long time over the dark screen. She had never been afraid to make a phone call like this before. In the end, she dialed Lee's number. The ringing tone echoed, dragging on, each ring testing her endurance. Sam's heart pounded so hard she had to press a hand to her chest and take a deep breath to keep from crying. The phone rang a third time, then a fourth. Just as she was about to think she wouldn't have the courage to wait any longer, the familiar voice finally came through. Lee speaking. Only 2 short words, yet Sam felt her throat tighten. It took her a few seconds before she could speak. I heard people say this land might be reclaimed. Someone came asking to buy it. I don't know if it's true. I'm scared. Her voice broke on the last word. Not from weakness, but from the fear of losing the only thing she had left. On the other end, Lee didn't ask any further questions. He stood up abruptly from his chair, the scrape of its legs against the floor soft but decisive. Listen to me carefully. His voice was low and steady, unwavering. Don't sign anything. Don't promise anything to anyone, not even verbally. Stay right there. Not sweet comfort. Not vague reassurance. Yet that clarity was enough for Sam's breathing to slowly steady. At least she knew she wasn't panicking alone. The call ended. Lee didn't return to his desk. He closed the open file, grabbed his jacket, and left the room without explanation. Curious glances followed him, but he didn't stop. This time he knew exactly where he was going. Not running from responsibility, but running toward someone standing on the edge of loss. The afternoon dragged on slowly, heavily, as if time itself were stretching out the waiting. Sam sat on the porch, her hands clasped tightly together on her knees. Her gaze didn't settle anywhere, drifting across the familiar yard. The garden was still there. The house was still there. Nothing seemed to have vanished. Yet Sam had never felt them so fragile. She had never thought she would lose everything. Not because she had never been afraid, but because she believed that what was built with sweat and patience at least deserved a chance to be protected. The afternoon wind slipped through the bamboo grove behind the house, carrying an unusual chill. Sam shivered, gripping her hands tighter, as if loosening them even a little would let everything slip beyond her reach. As the sky began to turn a grayish purple, a familiar sound rose at the gate. A car came to a stop. Sam looked up. Under the streetlight that had just flickered on, Lee stood there. His shirt was slightly wrinkled from haste, his face clearly worn from a long, relentless day. But his gaze was steady, fixed on her. I'm sorry. I'm late. Just those 4 simple words, yet Sam felt her eyes sting. Not from weakness, but because at last, her fear had someone standing beside it. Lee stepped a little closer. I'm here now, he said slowly, firmly. No one is allowed to pressure you. No further explanation was needed. No vows required. In the moment when the last light of day finally faded, Sam realized that what kept her standing wasn't only the land beneath her feet, but the feeling that she no longer had to face everything alone. The small kitchen lit up when Sam switched on the light. The soft yellow glow spilled across the old tiled floor, pushing back some of the darkness creeping in from the backyard. Sam stood at the sink and turned on the tap. The steady stream of water made a familiar rhythmic sound, as if it were trying to keep her breathing from drifting out of control. She washed the vegetables very slowly. Each leaf was lifted, gently smoothed, the soil from the garden carefully rinsed away. This familiar routine should have brought her a sense of calm, but today it felt more like an effort to keep herself from being swept away by the thoughts spiraling deep in her mind. Behind her, Lee stood by the stove. A small flame flickered to life with a faint crackling sound. He didn't speak right away. He didn't rush her either. The kitchen sank into a very different kind of silence, Not heavy, not strained. Just the quiet of two people who had come through a long, exhausting day. Lee was the first to break it. He talked about his work at the station. Cases piling one after another. Decisions that had to be made in short moments, where even the smallest mistake could lead to serious consequences. His voice was low and slow, without complaint, as if he were carefully peeling layers of pressure away from his chest.
Sam listened.
Then it was her turn to speak about the garden. About the small piece of land she had tended since the days when all she had was perseverance. About a very real fear. Not loud, not dramatic, but the feeling of being stripped of the right to keep something she had traded her youth to build. Sometimes I think, Sam said softly, almost as if speaking to herself, that maybe I'm not strong enough. Lee stopped what he was doing and turned to look at her. There was no judgment in his eyes. No pity. Just a steady gaze, one that saw everything Sam was carrying on her shoulders, everything she had endured, and everything she was still trying to protect. Those who choose to stay, Lee said slowly, each word clear. Those who dare to hold on to what they cherish, those are the strongest people. Sam didn't answer. She lowered her head and continued washing the vegetables. But inside, something had quietly been set back into its proper place. Silent, solid. Dinner was simple. No fuss, not many words. Yet the warmth from the hot soup gradually spread, easing the cold that had settled in Sam's heart. After the meal, Lee stood up. He picked up his phone and walked toward the window, where the kitchen light was just bright enough to reveal his face. The first call was made quickly. Then the second. The third. Lee spoke little and listened more. Sometimes he only nodded slightly. Sometimes he stayed silent for a long while. Professional connections built over years of work slowly reconnected. Fragments of information carefully pieced together. Sam sat quietly at the table. She didn't ask. She didn't press him. But the way her hands tightened on her lap betrayed the calm she was trying to maintain. Every passing second felt longer than usual. Finally, Lee lowered his phone. He turned back to Sam. His voice was low but clear. The rumors are false. Someone deliberately spread them to force a cheap sale of the land. Sam froze. She swallowed hard. So, I haven't lost anything.
No, Lee answered firmly.
And you won't.
No flowery promises.
No long explanations. Just two short sentences, yet enough to make Sam's shoulders sag, as if an invisible burden had just been set down on the kitchen floor. She lowered her head and took a deep breath. For the first time that afternoon, her breath no longer caught in her chest. Outside, night had fully settled. It arrived very quietly. Not the kind of night that falls abruptly and startles people, but a darkness that crept in slowly, slipping between the trees and gently covering the garden that had just endured a turbulent day. The last light of dusk faded from the familiar vegetable beds, leaving behind a deeper, calmer shade, softer even than exhaustion itself. In the yard, insects began to sing. At first just a few scattered sounds, then gradually blending into the familiar nighttime chorus of the countryside. Not lively, not hurried, just steady and persistent, like life itself quietly continuing despite the upheavals that had passed. Sam sat on the front steps. Her hands rested close together, no longer clenched as they had been in the afternoon, just quietly placed on her knees. She looked out at the darkened yard, where the morning sun had once shone brightly, where she had begun the day with the simple belief that everything was still within her grasp. The yard was still there, but the feeling inside her had changed. No longer panic, not yet complete calm, just a pause long enough for her to realize she had passed through the greatest fear of the day and was still standing. Lee sat beside her. The distance between them wasn't too close, but close enough to feel the warmth from the other's presence. They didn't touch. There were no gestures that crossed any boundary. Yet the distance that once existed between them was gone. This silence carried no worry, no pressure, no caution. It was the quiet of two people who were tired, who had endured tension, and who could finally allow themselves to breathe more slowly. Sam spoke first, her voice small and low, as if afraid to disturb the fragile peace. "Thank you." Just 2 words, but they were everything she could say at that moment. Lee turned to look at her. His gaze didn't avoid hers, nor did it push her. He didn't question, didn't wait for a response. He simply looked, as if listening to all the things Sam couldn't yet put into words. The fears she had hidden away, the years she had fought alone, and the rare vulnerability she seldom allowed herself to show. "I didn't come out of responsibility," Lee said after a brief silence. His voice was low and steady, neither raised nor evasive. "I came because I wanted to."
No rash premises. No loud commitments.
Just a truth placed down gently, like a small stone resting in the palm of a hand, light enough to seem as though the wind could carry it away, yet heavy enough to keep something from being knocked out of place. Sam said nothing more. She lowered her head, her lips curving into a very faint smile. It wasn't complete joy, nor did it erase all her worries, but it was enough to show that fear no longer filled her entirely. In its place was something else, fragile, cautious, but warm. She suddenly realized that what had kept her standing today wasn't only the piece of land that had just been saved, nor merely the fact that nothing had been lost. It was the feeling of having someone willing to stand beside her, without asking for reasons, without explanations, without demanding that she be stronger than she already was. After a while, Lee stood up. He wasn't in a hurry, nor was he lingering. He simply said that he would come back tomorrow, that he would go through all the necessary paperwork with Sam so no one could take advantage of her isolation again.
Sam nodded.
She didn't ask more, didn't worry. She trusted, not because everything had been fully resolved, but because of the way he had stayed today. When Lee left, his figure gradually disappeared down the small path leading out of the yard. His footsteps faded and dissolved into the night. Sam remained seated for a long while, not rushing to stand, as if she wanted that sense of safety to linger just a little longer. The night wind brushed through the bamboo behind the house. It was no longer as cold as it had been in the afternoon. It carried the scent of damp earth, wild grass, the smell of the garden she had nearly lost. Sam stood up, walked slowly into the yard, and looked again at each row of vegetables, each familiar corner of land. Everything was still there. And this time she no longer looked at it with fear, but with deeper gratitude than ever before, as if realizing that some things seem ordinary, and only when they are almost lost do people understand how deeply they have loved them. Inside the house, the kitchen light was still on. Sam turned back, reached out to switch it off and closed the door. The house sank into quiet, but it wasn't empty. On the contrary, it felt fuller, filled with a sense of safety she hadn't dared to believe she deserved for a very long time. That night Sam slept deeply. Not because all her worries had disappeared. Not because the future had suddenly become clear. But because for the first time in many years, she knew that if more storms came, she would no longer have to face them alone. The story ends there. Not with a promise for a lifetime, not with a future already drawn, but with a simple choice steady enough to hold on to stay, to trust, and to move forward together.
Xin chào mọi người, cảm ơn mọi người đã xem hết video hôm nay của mình. Chúc mọi người có một ngày mới vui vẻ, hạnh phúc và một ngày làm việc tràn đầy năng lượng. Hy vọng rằng mọi người sẽ yêu thích những câu chuyện mình chia sẻ và ủng hộ kênh cho mình để mình có động lực làm nhiều video hơn, cũng như để mọi người cùng lắng nghe những câu chuyện của mình và thư giãn sau một ngày làm việc mệt mỏi. Nếu mà mọi người yêu thích kênh của mình và những câu chuyện mình chia sẻ thì mọi người nhớ like, share, bật chuông thông báo để nhận thông báo khi mình đăng video mới nhất, và chia sẻ kênh của mình đến cho bạn bè để mọi người cùng biết đến kênh của mình. Cảm ơn mọi người đã lắng nghe hết những chia sẻ của mình và đồng hành cùng mình trong thời gian qua. Hẹn gặp lại mọi người ở trong những video tiếp theo của mình nha.